after 6 p.m., donations to the museum will be matched as part of Do More 24, a statewide 24-hour giving campaign. I'll drop a link to that in the chat momentarily. I'm so pleased to introduce today's speakers, Holly Trostle Brigham and Nat Reeve. Nat is a writer, researcher, and 2020 Amy P. Goldman Pre-Raphaelite Fellow at the University of Delaware and the Delaware Art Museum. Nat's currently completing their PhD at Royal Holloway, University of London, in which they're queer reading Elizabeth Siddal's art, poetry, haunted landscapes, and medievalist iconography. Their debut novel, Nettleback, a queer neo-Victorian adventure following a runaway heiress and the crime-fighting misfits she befriends, will be published in the UK by Cipher Press this June, and it's available for pre-order. I will drop a link in the chat. And just a request to mute from our audience today. Holly Trostle Brigham is a painter who creates life-size figures in watercolor that depict historical and mythological women. Brigham's solo exhibit at the Delaware Art Museum just opened. I Wake Again, Holly Trostle Brigham on Elizabeth Siddal will be on view through May 29th. Brigham's work is also on view in a concurrent exhibit at the Somerville Manning Gallery. The artist has an upcoming exhibition at the Reading Museum in 2023. Her work has been exhibited at the Michener Museum and the Southern Alleghenies Museum of Art. Brigham's recent book, artist book, I Wake Again, which I hope we'll hear more about today, has been placed at the Beinecke Library, Rutgers University, the University of Delaware Library, and the Fisher Fine Arts Library at the University of Pennsylvania. It's a collaboration with the poet Kim Bridgeford. Brigham was born in Carlisle, PA, attended Smith College, where she studied art history and studied abroad in Florence, Italy. She went on to study art history at the University of Pittsburgh, fine art at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and earned her MFA at George Washington University. Brigham has taught at Pasadena City College, Worcester State College, the Worcester Art Museum, and the Baum School of Art. Brigham lives in Philadelphia with her husband, David, and 2 children, Noble and Flora, and their dog, Minnie. And now I am so pleased to welcome Holly and Nat to today's art chat.
Thank you so much, Amelia. That was very nice. Welcome, everyone. I'm Holly, and it's so nice that you could take some time out of your day to be with Nat and me today as we explore Elizabeth Siddal. And I wanted to thank Margaretta Frederick and all of the staff at the Delaware Art Museum for bringing my exhibition to such a beautiful end. I think it looks gorgeous. I hope you all get a chance to see it. And I feel very fortunate to have my work on Elizabeth Siddal on view right now. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I also wanted to thank Nat Reeve for being willing to participate in this talk today. I think that their work, interpretation of Siddal's work, is original and groundbreaking, and I can't wait to hear what Nat has to teach us today. I am a feminist artist, and for all of my career, I've been painting women artists and writers and actors. I've been attempting to tell their stories and make people aware of their creative output. I have always loved the Pre-Raphaelites, and at some point in 2019, I decided to start to make an artist book on Elizabeth Siddal. Once I was offered this exhibition at the Delaware Art Museum, the book became expanded to include a textile design, clay tiles, a painted wooden screen, and a large watercolor portrait of Elizabeth Siddal. Elizabeth Siddal was born in 1829 and died at the age of 32 in 1862. She was a creative force and produced drawings, watercolors, and oils. She wrote poetry, and in fact, I Wake Again, the title of the show, comes from one of her poems. It's also the title of the artist book. She painted the figure of Rachel from the Old Testament at the Red House, created a lovely wedding present, which was a painted box for Jane Morris, and planned to illustrate books. Siddal had a collaborative nature. Sadly, she had also an addiction to laudanum, and died of an overdose. Laudanum was an opioid, and it was prescribed to, it seemed to be especially women who perhaps people saw as being maybe emotional, perhaps depressed. So sadly, she died prematurely. But it's my intention to celebrate Siddal and to create work on a scale and using mediums that she likely would have used if she had lived longer. Okay, so what we're looking at here on the screen are three works. The one on the far left is by Dante Gabriele Rossetti of Elizabeth Siddal. So it is a portrait. It's at the Delaware Art Museum. The work in the center is a self-portrait by Elizabeth Siddal. It's a very small oil painting, about 9 inches by 9 inches. And then the work on the right is her Holy Family. It's also at the Delaware Art Museum. And I wanted to put these up to sort of give you an idea of what she looked like, to see how her husband was portraying her. So it's in a very typical Pre-Raphaelite pose. She's got her eyes downcast. She's in a very sort of pensive mood. When she's doing her self-portrait, she is looking straight at us. And I think it has a totally different psychological feeling to it.
Holly, I apologize, but I'm hearing some feedback.
Oh, okay. I don't hear that. So what should we do?
Give me one moment. Okay, Holly, go ahead. Apologies for that.
Okay. And then if you look at her, Elizabeth Siddal's Holy Family, I want you to see, especially note the palette, because the palette is something that I take into account when I am working on my own work that's been influenced by Elizabeth Siddal's work. On the left, which appears to be very blurry, I hope it's clearer for you guys, is Malaise Ophelia. This is probably a painting that is something that you have all seen before. Elizabeth Siddal was the model for this painting, and it's at the Tate Museum in London. So she is posing here. She is, if you know the story of Ophelia from Shakespeare, she kills herself. And Elizabeth Siddal posed for this particular painting in a bathtub in very cold weather and got very sick while doing it because it took many sessions. In my artist book that you can see at the museum, I have one of the images in the artist book is based on her posing for this particular painting. If we look at the image on the right, we see a watercolor by Elizabeth Siddal. And I have to tell you that I am especially drawn to her watercolors because I am a watercolor artist. I love her use of color, the use of the white paper, the transparency and the luminosity that she gets in her work. Many people consider that the standing figure on the right is actually a self-portrait. But also, especially this painting, you will see when you see my painting in a few minutes, that the palette is something that I was looking very closely at. Now, I want to tell you about the subject of my painting. So it's Elizabeth Siddal as Mariana. And Mariana was a figure in, first we'll go back to Shakespeare. So she is a character in his play Measure for Measure. And she's a tragic figure in the sense that she has basically been jilted by her lover, and she is sort of pining away, if you will, in her house for him. And it's explored a little bit more in Tennyson writes a poem about her, and that is the specific basis for my painting. And in the poem, he discusses more about her, but I wanted to show you that, and I will get to Tennyson in a moment, but I wanted to show you some examples of other Pre-Raphaelite artists who also painted Mariana. And Elizabeth Siddal is not the model for either of these, but this is Malaise Mariana from 1851. And here she is, she's alone, she's staring off into space, and we get a sense of all these gorgeous medieval elements in the space where she is. And the painting on the right is by the woman artist Marie Stillman. And I really, really love this one. She's also, though, she's doing the Pre-Raphaelite thing. She has the figure kind of staring off into space. But I feel a little bit more connected to this painting. We're brought in closer to her space. The figure's larger. And once again, I really, really love the palette that she's using. Just two more images of the Pre-Raphaelites dealing with the subject of Mariana. Here on the left, we see an ink drawing by Rossetti of Siddal as Mariana. It's a little unclear exactly what she's doing to me. At least I'm not sure what she's doing there but she's kind of collapsed a little bit against this curtain. She has books, she's been reading books. She looks a bit distraught. And the image of Mariana on the right is by Rossetti, and it's actually Jane Morris. So this was painted after Siddal died. And the subject of Mariana was taken up quite a bit by the Pre-Raphaelites, though it's not as popular as the subject of, say, the Lady of Shalott, where it's almost like every single Pre-Raphaelite artist painted her. But I wanted to choose Mariana because I wanted to have the opportunity to take a subject that I knew they dealt with, to think, well, perhaps Siddal would have painted Mariana if she'd lived longer. She would have been interested in it because all of her, the artists in her group were also dealing with that subject. But I also wanted to kind of turn it on its end in a way. So here we have my painting. This is Elizabeth Siddal as Mariana. I finished it last year. It's 60 inches by 40 inches. It's on a very large sheet of Arches watercolor. It's a 500-pound piece of paper, so very, very heavy and very thick. So when I decided to do this painting, I had to kind of come up with first the subject. Okay, well, the subject's Elizabeth Siddal, but then Elizabeth Siddal is posing as someone. Who's she going to be in the painting? I went to Tennyson because Tennyson was Siddal's favorite poet. And so I started to read his poems, and I really was taken by the poem of Mariana. I liked the repetition, and I liked the images that I started to see. So I'll just read you a couple little excerpts from the poem, and then you'll start to see some of the ideas that came to me. With blackest moss, the flower pots were thickly crusted, one and all. The rusted nails fell from the knots that led to the pair to the gable wall. And then another section. After the flitting of the bats, when thickest dark did trance the sky, she drew her casement curtain by. And ever when the moon was low and the shrill winds were up and away in the white curtain to and fro, the blue fly sung in the pane, the slow clock ticking. Okay, So when I read it a number of times. I read some of the other poems, but I kept going back to Mariana because I thought, okay, I have bats, I have a moon that's low in the sky, I have a casement window, I have a pear, I have a blue fly, I have this idea of waiting. And I thought, and the clock ticking, and I thought this would start to form a setting and a composition for me. Here I'm sharing with you some of my preliminary work for the painting. So on the left, I had my model come a number of times for the painting. She is a young lady named Moira. She has red hair, and I felt that she resembled Siddal. So the first drawing, this is just like what we call a thumbnail sketch. So, you know, something probably on a piece of computer paper. She's sitting at the desk, and it's a chair that we have in our house, and her hair is down, and she's got one hand to her face, and the other hand is kind of holding her elbow, and she's looking down. And even the little closer view at the top, she's looking down. I also have like a Tudor rose, thinking about using that somewhere, so that's also on the page. Then if you look at the second image, this is usually what I do. I start to do another thumbnail where I think about light, and it's just done with an ink pen. This is probably actually smaller. This is maybe more like 5 by 6 inches or something. But I have the same pose. I have her looking down, but then I start to think about these compositional elements that are in the finished painting. So we have the bats up in the corner, we have the window, we have something that they're hanging on, the bats are hanging on, there's the moon, there's a clock, there's a light source on the table. And then I even start to think about the frame, which is kind of interesting. And I have at the bottom, measure for measure, measuring device. So measure for measure is referencing Shakespeare's play where we get Mariana. And the measuring device is me thinking about what else I could possibly include in the painting. Then the image on the right is also kind of on computer paper. It's kind of buckled. It's not great quality paper, but it starts to tell you, it starts to develop the palette for the painting. I'm thinking about sort of a teal dress, red chair, blueness in the sky. We have the white casement curtain, window curtain that we heard in the play. And then I start to think about the cord at the bottom. Now, I have an art history background. And so when I start to think about doing big paintings, I always have these images and references in my head that I oftentimes will develop or think about more in my work. So these two masters sort of are referenced. Carlo Crivelli on the left has always been one of my absolutely favorite artists. And he was, you know, we could say he was before Raphael. He was not on the Pre-Raphaelites immortal list, sadly. I mean, I don't know if they were aware of his work, but I like to think that maybe they were. You know, the immortal list, if you don't know about that, I find that very interesting. There are only 2 women listed on the immortal list. We have Mrs. Browning, for Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and we have Joan of Arc. So that's kind of interesting all in itself, just as a little aside. But Carlo Crivelli has always been one of my favorite artists. And I thought when I read about the pear, I thought, okay, I could have a pear hanging from something at the top of the painting, and that would reference Carlo Crivelli. Carlo Crivelli's paintings always have these garlands. They have lots of fruit. Sometimes there are giant pickles with lots of little bumps and warts on them. It's always very fascinating. You're not really sure why they are there, but I love them. I love the 3-dimensional quality of them. And So the pear in my painting is a direct reference to Crivelli. And I put Albrecht Dürer's Melancholia on the right because it in some ways is even more important to my painting. I started to, when I was thinking about Mariana and sort of the sadness and the mood in the poem, sort of the Gothic quality of the poem and the sadness of what she's feeling emotionally, I thought of Melancholia. So it's already sort of, you know, melancholy. It's like almost like a depressed subject. And I wanted to explore that more. Look at her pose, the figure of Melancholia in this print. This is an engraving. Do you see how it echoes my Mariana in my painting? And she's actually holding calipers, which are measuring devices. They can be used by architects or draftspeople or artists. So measure for measure, I thought I can use this drawing device. I can put it in my painting as well. And if you look really closely, I think this may be a blurred image again. I'm not sure. I hope you can see it more clearly than I can right now. But in the back, you see there's a little, there's like a sun, and then there's a banner that says Melancholia. And if you look closely, what's carrying Melancholia is a bat. So all of these things started to go through my head, and I thought, okay, I'm going to somehow, you know, work this into my painting. So if you look on the table where Mariana is, you will see a drawing of Dürer's Melancholia. And there's also a little cobalt blue ink bottle and an ink pen. So what I'm saying here in the painting is that Mariana has been going through the night. She's been alone, but she's been productive. She is an artist. She's been working on this, doing a copy, what we call a copy of a master work. So she's done it in ink, even though the original is an engraving. And she has made it, she's echoing this pose, and you see the calipers lying on top of the drawing. Can you all see those? So that was sort of what I was talking about in Dürer's print. So a reference to measure for measure and connecting it to Dürer. And then on the back, you see, I mean, at the top of the painting, you see the pear hanging from a red rope. And on the pear is this blue fly that's kind of chewing away. The pear's in a state of deterioration. And I kind of like to think that the bats, and they're actually fruit bats that you would find in England. So that they've just taken some bites of the pear. Now they're napping up on the left-hand corner of the painting. And the bats they stuck out to me immediately because I thought of how we were hearing about bats during the beginning of the pandemic and whether or not they had something to do with the cause of the pandemic. And so I just thought that they would be interesting to put in the painting. I wanted to show you a little bit more of how I do my research. I look for historical objects. And what we have here are two items. So it's Hugin's chair, which is at the Met. This is the chair that my Mariana is sitting on. So it's got like the Tudor embossed gold rose in the back. It's leather. I love Hugin's work. He was a craftsperson designer and was sort of very essential in the rebirth of the Gothic movement in England. So a little bit earlier than Siddal, but I really thought that would kind of work in the painting. And then on the right, we see Teishan Peel's butterfly collection at Drexel University. And I wanted to show you this because I was looking, when I have the butter collection on Mariana's table, I was looking at this collection and I really love the Italian marbleized paper that's on the wooden box. So I wanted to include that as well. So I made a sort of a British casement window. I have the moon that's low in the sky. The clock is a Gothic revival clock. The light is a period storm light. And this isn't exactly the clock, but it's a similar clock. This is the textile that I use this pattern, which is period to Elizabeth Siddal's time. It's in the V&A, and I put this on the casement window. So you see it at the bottom. So the curtain is white, but it's kind of being made blue and gray from the colors from the outside of the night sky is reflecting onto the curtains. And I wanted to make this painting to kind of represent almost, if you will, as if Elizabeth Siddal made a self-portrait of herself as Mariana. She is looking out at us, so there is that engagement with the viewer, and it's giving her power. She's a life-size figure, so she's on equal ground with the people looking at the painting. She may be sad and melancholy, but she's just gotten through the night. She's created this beautiful work of art. She has objects on her table to keep her busy. She's got this butterfly collection. She has this little black box, which is actually like a tintype box. And so we can imagine if that were to open, there would be a tintype, an early photograph inside. And we wonder possibly who might be on that. So there's a lot of sort of story, and you kind of become engaged with the painting and try to figure out all these things. One more thing before I thank you for your time and patience and turn it over to Nat, but I wanted to also say that the table is also a Pugin design as well. So thank you so very much, and let's sit back and enjoy Nat's talk.
Thanks so much, Holly. That's, as always, it's just so fascinating to hear about your work and about the intricacies of Elizabeth Siddal as Mariana. So yeah, I shall share my screen now. Make it work. Fantastic. So I wanted to start also by saying thank you to Holly, to Amelia, to Margareta Frederick, Mark Samuels Lasner, and the Amy P. Goldman Pre-Raphaelite Fellowship, and to the Delaware Art Museum for bringing me into this marvelous network of Pre-Raphaelite scholars, collectors, and practitioners, and for inviting me to speak today. I had the pleasure of seeing Holly Trostle Brigham's work when I was staying in Delaware for the fellowship in September 2021. And if you'd like to read more about my thoughts, I refer you to my blog post, which is currently up on the museum's website. So for today, as so much of Brigham's art is about pictures within pictures and referencing and reworking traditions from an earlier historical period, I thought I'd talk a bit about how Siddal does that too in her own artistic practice. The material that I'm drawing on here is from my article, An Hour Before the Day, the Dismembered Book of Hours in Elizabeth Siddal's Clark Saunders, which will be available to read soon in the journal Word and Image. I'm also going to talk a little bit about my approach to Siddal in my PhD and why I think that queer reading her art is a brilliant way of bringing out its disruptive workings. So I'm going to draw you all into the world of Siddal's 1857 watercolor Clark Saunders. As a painting set according to the ballad it's based on, quote, An Hour Before the Day, I think it speaks to Brigham's Elizabeth Siddal as Mariana, which is itself poised in the nighttime. At this strange, transformative, uncertain hour when you've got through the night, but you don't yet know what you might have to face in the coming day, Brigham's Siddal Mariana sets down her drawing and looks up, and Siddal's heroine, May Margaret, completes a very different kind of ritual. So what's going on in Siddal's painting? Margaret, the woman on the left, kisses a willow wand for her fiancé Clark Saunders, the man on the right. Saunders is dead, undead, a revenant, stabbed the day before by Margaret's brothers after sneaking into bed with her. He's come back from his grave to set the couple free from their binding lovers' vows. The pair enact a ritual separation, where Margaret's gift of the wand releases Saunders from his spectral state. It's a depiction of the climactic scene from the ballad Clark Saunders, as retold in novelist and poet Walter Scott's collection of folk ballads, Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. But Siddal, like Brigham, has an eye for adding details not present in the source material, and adds one here. Clasped shut on the prayer lectern, beneath the lover's attention, is Margaret's Book of Hours. Though, unlike Siddal Mariana's copy of Dürer's Melancholia, we cannot see the artworks inside the book's closed covers, this book opens up the painting's meaning and implications. It's a similar effect to that caused by the closed photograph case in Brigham's painting, allowing both artists to explore the potentiality of the unseen contents. Brigham and Siddal are working with another parallel strategy too. As Brigham references traditions, stories, and visual motifs from the Victorian period in her contemporary art, Siddal draws on medieval iconography and subject matter for her Victorian art. Books of Hours, popular in the late medieval period, contained prayers for each canonical hour of the day, abbreviated from monastic devotions, with illustrations depicting scenes from the Virgin's life. The devout medieval layperson could mark the hours, with concessions of timing to accommodate their lay status. The early hours were kept around dawn rather than at the starker monastic times of midnight or 3 a.m. Books were commissioned to mark important social occasions like engagements and marriages. This practice continued into the Victorian period, though in post-Reformation Britain, it took the form of adding a Victorian title page to a medieval Book of Hours. These books were intensely personalized. Owners could choose their content, add and annotate material, and have themselves and their book painted into its miniatures. The style of Siddal's painting is medievalist, in the angular, androgynous figures with their stylized drapery, the small space with its far-reaching window, and the book on the lectern. This book clearly evokes the way the Book of Hours was depicted in its own miniatures. Books could be shown open or closed, but closed books occur in the matins illuminations of these 3 books of Hours, all of which Siddal likely saw. These books were owned by Siddal's patron, the art critic John Ruskin, between 1855 and 1857, during which time he invited his protege to come to his house and, quote, look at a missal or two. Ruskin was a voracious collector of medieval manuscripts, and his autobiography describes buying his first Book of Hours, the one in the middle, in 1850 or 1851. Quote, the new worlds which every leaf of this book opened to me cannot be told. Though few of Siddal's personal papers and nothing autobiographical survives, there is ample reason to speculate that Books of Hours similarly inspired her with new worlds and creative possibilities. After her visits to Ruskin's house and following a trip to, quote, sundry colour men with the money he gave her, Siddal's art took a new direction, moving from black and white drawings and dark oil self-portraits to these medievalist watercolours. And, just as the Book of Hours unleashed new worlds in Ruskin's imagination, Margaret's Book of Hours brings new worlds into Siddal's painting, in a manner distinct from other significant medieval books in Pre-Raphaelite works. Unlike, for instance, Maurice Bartali Stillman's Beatrice in the Delaware Art Museum, Siddal's Book of Hours achieves its effect by staying shut, evoking Book of Hours conventions without having to replicate this book's precise, personalized content. This evasive refusal to fix down stable content is emblematic of Siddal's whole artistic methodology. In her corpus, stable content is continually uprooted, and symbols are referenced only to be disturbed or dismembered. That's why I find it so helpful to use queer theory to close read Siddal's work. The critic Louise Tondeur treats queerness as, quote, that which mismatches, defamiliarizes, destabilizes, disidentifies, and decenters, and she uses Siddal as an example through which to demonstrate a, quote, methodology for queer reading, albeit via the posthumous mythology about Siddal's hair. But the methodology Siddal's myth helped shape works even better for reading her creative work. I'm reading Clark Saunders' Queer, and in my PhD thesis, I'm also reading Queer a number of other Siddal works, bringing out their destabilizing impulses. And in doing so, I'm inspired by the fact that it's also what Siddal does. Siddal, who almost always bases her artwork on literary source material, is a queer reader, enacting her readings in her art. Her queer reading of Clark Saunders' The Ballad in Clark Saunders' The Painting breaks apart fixed meanings and motifs to explore, as Brigham herself does, how to depict thwarted potential and an untimely curtailment. So how does she do this? Well, let's have a look. In Scott's version of Clark Saunders, Saunders the Revenant begs Margaret to complete this ritual to set him free, but she refuses to do so until he, with his new knowledge of the, quote, heavens high, tells her, quote, what comes of women who die in strong travelling, meaning childbirth. The question implies that Margaret is pregnant with Saunders' child, worried she won't survive labour, and fearful about what this might mean for her future. Saunders tries to reassure her, somewhat frantically because he's working on a time limit of his own. As with all medieval revenants, he can't stay past cockcrow, and it's already an hour before the day, the time at which Margaret is meant to be reading matins from her Book of Hours. We're going to unpick two things here. Firstly, why is the hour of matins so significant to Margaret's fears? And secondly, why is Margaret pointedly not praying at the time she's supposed to? In Books of Hours, there are set images to accompany each canonical hour, and the miniature which traditionally accompanies matins is a depiction of the Annunciation. The Books of Hours in Ruskin's collection feature a recurring set of visual motifs in their matins annunciations. A Book of Hours is present in the picture, as is a lily, a stem-like object held out by Gabriel towards the Virgin, and strategic architectural shaping to emphasize their halos. The Hours of Yolande of Navarre on the right also features a floor-length window through which Gabriel enters, a kneeling angel, a couch or bed for the Virgin to sit on, and a lectern for the book in its second appearance below the main miniature. When we reflect that the Annunciation is a dialogue between a woman and the supernatural being that has entered her room, a dialogue which concerns the fate of the woman's pregnancy, its significance to Clark Saunders and Margaret's apprehensions becomes immediately apparent. Siddal's pictorial entangling of Saunders and Margaret's ritual with the sacred encounter, however, relies not just on the similarity of the premise, but on vigorous engagement with medieval Annunciation motifs. Lilies are always present at the Annunciation, and there's a lily in Clark Saunders in the hand of the angel painted on the side of the lectern. Saunders's ghost enters Margaret's room through a floor-length window. Margaret's furnishings, couch, lectern, Book of Hours, are all Annunciation staples. There's a stem-like object being passed between the figures. But it gets more complicated. Siddal's allusions to Annunciation motifs fulfill Tondeur's queer prerequisites. They mismatch, defamiliarize, destabilize, disidentify, and decenter them. Margaret does not play Mary's part, nor Saunders Gabriel's, nor even vice versa. Instead, the Virgin and Gabriel's roles and attributes are broken up and distributed between Margaret and Saunders. Though Saunders appears at the window, and though his appearance and posture parallel the angel on the lectern, the similarities only flag up what Saunders does not have, a lily or a halo or wings. Saunders stands slightly too close to Margaret for the window's shape to provide him with the halo he lacks. Though he brings knowledge from the heavens high, his knowledge is borrowed and blackmailed out of him, and he can't guarantee his beloved an ideal trajectory in the manner of angelic speech. Instead, it is Margaret who kneels, as Gabriel does, to give Saunders the object with the supernatural power to transform his state of being. Bringing the Annunciation into Clark Saunders via the Book of Hours results in a pictorial dismemberment which reduces the sacred composition to disarticulated bits. The Annunciation's stable promise of successful pregnancy and a bright future is broken up and placed in a context where it can no longer convey this meaning. Margaret and Saunders's Matins encounter curtails, not enables, their bright future. This ritual parts them forever. And Margaret is afraid of her pregnancy as an end, not a beginning. The shattered and disarrayed Annunciation motifs are co-opted to depict this moment of fear, uncertainty, and misery, wrenched out of order to tell a very different tale from the one they have always told in the Book of Hours. Siddal's work with these motifs also, though I don't have the time today to go into full detail, dismantles the composition of a medievalist Annunciation painted by her partner Dante Gabriel Rossetti in 1851. For more information about what's going on there, I refer you to my upcoming article. But today, I'm keeping the focus on reading Siddal's art alongside Brigham's and tracing their shared strategies and mutual concerns, which leads us to the last part of my talk and my second question. Why is Margaret not praying at the hour of Matins? Margaret and Saunders ignoring the book is, again, a disruption of Annunciation conventions. In Matins miniatures, the Virgin is interrupted whilst reading. Either the book is open or, as in Ruskin's books, Mary holds it clasped to her chest. Other Pre-Raphaelite depictions of prayer books follow a similar principle. In Charles Collins's 1851 Convent Thoughts on the top right, the nun holds her book open, and Stillman's ponderous Beatrice on the bottom right keeps her place on the page with her fingertip. But Margaret's book is shut. She's nowhere near it. Prior to Saunders's appearance, she was seemingly in bed, and the pristine book looks untouched. Though the angel on the lectern stares at it, Margaret and Saunders pointedly won't. And, just to make the situation stranger, Siddal includes a second book in the painting, in a much more accessible location in the alcove above Margaret's bed, next to a crucifix with loose pages poking out. What if, then, we read the alcove book as an older prayer book, now falling apart, and the book on the lectern as a new purchase? The lectern book's lavishness and prominent display suggest that it was bought in recognition of an important occasion. As I mentioned, it was common practice for wealthy women to get books of hours to celebrate their engagements and marriages. And Margaret, described as, quote, a king's daughter in minstrelsy, is certainly rich. We also know from the ballad that Margaret and Saunders are engaged. When Saunders wants to sneak into her rooms, Margaret points out that they could just wait till once we married be. Siddal seizes on this hint of impending marriage and presents it in the form of a book. The Book of Hours on the lectern could be a recent acquisition commissioned by the characters to celebrate their imminent wedding. But in the wake of Saunders' murder, this new, now useless book represents a happy future which has been lost and no longer corresponds to the ballad's trajectory. And Siddal pushes this irony further. As I said, the style of Clark Saunders is medievalist, drawing on Book of Hours pictorial conventions to craft its depiction of Margaret and Saunders. Book of Hours owners were frequently shown in their miniatures. In the Hours of Yolande of Navarre, the book's owner prays at her lectern under the picture, and several Books of Hours feature married couples praying together. But instead of opening the lectern book and showing pages celebrating Margaret and Saunders as a couple, Siddal emulates the stylistic techniques to paint the nightmarish ritual which replaces this marital bliss and cuts off the chance of there ever being a wedding to celebrate. Margaret and Saunders' post-mortem matins, as painted by Siddal, displays the moment at which all chances of that bright future are curtailed. Siddal's exploration of how to depict an untimely curtailment certainly speaks to Brigham's exhibition, which explores the same idea in Siddal's life. Siddal died at 32, and her social class and gender straightened her resources for developing her craft. She was, for example, only able to buy the paints for Clark Saunders when Ruskin started paying her an allowance, but she was forced to break off this allowance because of Ruskin's controlling behaviour, including his insistence that she stop depicting ghosts. Siddal, as you see, did not stop depicting ghosts. And there is a strange sense of agency in Clark Saunders, even if that agency is ultimately thwarted. So, in light of Brigham's determination to present Siddal as an active agent despite her curtailed potential, I'll end with thinking about Margaret and Saunders in a similar way. In Clark Saunders, Siddal recognises her character's agency, rather than depicting them as passive participants in a predetermined ballad plot. And she does it queerly. Noreen Giffney highlights queer theory's power to, quote, expose all norms for the way they define, solidify, and defend their shaky self-identities by excluding those dissident others who fail or refuse to conform. Clark Saunders enacts this process of exposure through its inclusion of the Book of Hours. The potential wedded bliss of Margaret and Saunders, represented by the book, is a dissident other to the ballad's plot, which relies on them being tragically separated. But the book is still present, still evidence of Margaret and Saunders preparing for that dissident other happy ending, and refusing to exclude the book from the painting unsettles the centrality of the established story. With that Book of Hours, Siddal shows us the world of the painting from the perspective of its characters, not just as two tragic figures doomed to a fixed ending, but as active agents who filled the room with objects that anticipated a different outcome. Thank you. I think that's me done. So now it's time for questions. So Amelia, do you want to take it away?
Sure, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Please feel free to type into the chat questions for Nat and Holly, or you can unmute yourself.
And while we're waiting for questions, I mean, I have questions for Holly, obviously. It's always so wonderful to hear you talk about Elizabeth Siddal as Mariana. I think it's such a fascinating painting. I wonder, could you talk a bit more about the Fairy Queen screen, which is one of my favorite things in the exhibition, and I couldn't really mention it in my blog post, and I just think it's really cool, and I'd love to hear about it.
Oh, sure. So everyone, I hope you get the opportunity to see the exhibition. It's up until the end of May at the Delaware Art Museum. And Nat is asking me about the subjects in the, there is a painted wooden screen, which is a sort of Gothic revival architectural style screen. And it has 8 figures at the bottom. And the figures are heroines from Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, which was written 1504, I think, and was dedicated to Queen Elizabeth I. We're talking, Shakespeare time, that period. And I have always loved the Fairy Queen, and I thought, some of the Pre-Raphaelites painted Una, and there's evidence of some of them turning to the Fairy Queen for source material. And I thought that Elizabeth Siddal as a poet definitely would have read that and would have been aware of it. So I wanted to kind of explore it. And so the heroines are, there are like so many characters in the Fairy Queen. If you haven't read it, you should read it. But one of my favorite figures is Britomart, who was a female knight. And my daughter Flora is the model for Britomart on the screen. And Flora is actually the model for 2 of the figures, also Florimel. So Florimel, she seemed to be an obvious choice. Her friend Maria is the model for the twins, Belphoebe and Amaretta, and they're in the center of one of the sides of the screen. And then the other side of the screen has Gloriana and Una, and they're all Moira, who was the model for Elizabeth Siddal. So you've got 4 figures that are redheads, they're all the same model, but yet they're the different characters from the poem. And so I just had so much fun doing it, Nat. There's symbolism. I mean, they're basically presented, you know, they're almost like icons in a way. So they have attributes and symbols that are referenced in the Fairy Queen. And if you explore Carlo Crivelli, who, if you remember, is one of the sources for inspiration for me, you will see that he oftentimes did the saints sort of in, you know, single figures. And you will, if you look at that first and then you go see the show, you will make some connections. I don't know, Nat, does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, no, I just love hearing about it, because when I saw it, it wasn't fully complete. So,
oh yeah. So I should, you know what? I will send you some photographs.
Yes, fantastic. That'd be so great. Did you manage to gild it in the end? I remember that was the thing you were thinking.
No, that's right. So Nat's asking a question. So the background of the figures is a solid color. It's actually a pigment that's called caput mortem, which is basically death. It's kind of like a reddish color, and so it's kind of like life force, but it's also kind of like when I think about resurrection and rebirth, and I think about that color for some reason. And I also wanted it to maybe act as a color for bole, which is the color that in the Middle Ages, or whenever anyone does gold leaf, you put this pigment down that's kind of a reddish brown color, and then you put the gold leaf on top, and it actually gives your gold sort of a reddish tint. And so initially I was thinking I would then put gold leaf on top of each of the backgrounds of the figures. And when Nat came to visit, Margareta, the curator of the exhibition, was also in the room, and they got to see it in progress. And I remember saying, I was thinking about gold in the background, and I kind of looked at Margareta quickly, and she didn't make her expression was kind of like, no, maybe not. So then I thought, maybe not, because she was thinking it would maybe create more of an ecclesiastical look. And she's right, for sure. I mean, I do love gold and silver, and I do have it in a number of my paintings over the decades. So it would have been in keeping with my work, but I kind of thought about that. And then the more I progressed with the paintings, the more I kind of really just liked it as the sort of darkish red color. And it made me think of the frescoes in Pompeii. Now, of course, the frescoes in Pompeii are a brighter red, but then I thought, that's kind of cool. So I'm going to keep them like that. Do we have any questions, Amelia?
We do. We have a question for each of you from Mary writing in the chat. She says, thank you so much. I appreciate the queer reading of Siddal's work. Mary, would you like to voice this? You're welcome to.
Sure. I mean, I was really struck by the queer reading and how applicable it is to her poetry. But one of the things that I was thinking of during Nat's talk on Clark Saunders was how difficult it is to resist looking at Siddal's work from an autobiographical perspective. And the dissident ending really stuck out at me from an autobiographical perspective. And I was wondering if I could hear Nat's thoughts on that. And my question for Holly was, from the first time I saw your Siddal as Mariana, I was really struck by how you departed from the norms of Pre-Raphaelite portraiture in how the paleness of skin is so highlighted. And you really departed from that. And considering the immense detail that you've put into this work, which is really fascinating, I really want to see it in person. I was wondering if you could talk more on that. So whoever'd like to go first.
Nat, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. That's a really interesting question, and I love you saying that you've seen the queerness in Siddal's poetry, because I definitely have as well. My thesis is interdisciplinary. It's about the art and the poetry, and yeah, I wish I could have talked more about the poetry today. I had a whole extra point about a particular Siddal poem that I think really speaks to the way she does Clark Saunders. Excellent. Yes, love Serena Trowbridge. So that's the really good edition of Siddal's poetry, by the way, for everyone, edited by Serena Trowbridge, and it's called My Lady's Soul, the Poems of Elizabeth Eleanor Siddal, and it's the first edition that reproduces the poems as Siddal wrote them, rather than going through the extensive alterations of William Michael or Dante Gabriel Rossetti. As regards evading or resisting an autobiographical lens for Siddal's work, I think partly I have to remember that Siddal herself can't take this kind of this holistic view. By the time that she had painted Clark Saunders, a lot of the elements to do with kind of separation and difficult pregnancies and things had not actually happened to Siddal yet. So she couldn't have been writing it with that in mind. And I also think that even though it's really hard to almost get away from this compulsion to point to things in Siddal's work and gesture towards Siddal's life, I think partially because there's so little material on Siddal's life, there's nothing that's actually autobiographical, and there are so many gaps and so many uncertainties that we just grasp at whatever we can get. But I think it's really important to resist the impulse, because the minute you take it away, you suddenly end up with all these wonderful readings. Like for the poetry, for instance, you get the queer readings of the poetry the minute you stop assuming that every poem is narrated by Siddal about Rossetti. And then suddenly you take away this heterosexual cisgendered framework, and you can suddenly think about what might actually be taking place on the page. What can I just get from the page if I take away any compulsion to point and say, oh, that must refer to that, or whatever. So yeah, I very much try to resist any kind of autobiographical reading. And I also like to think about not just what Siddal's work might have meant to her and might have meant then in the Victorian period. I like to think about what it might mean now and what new readings we can apply to it and how much more we can open up, because her work is so rich and can speak to so many different things. So I think that's another really good reason for avoiding the autobiographical. Right, okay, I see the time. Holly, go for it.
Well, so you're asking about, you know, if you think about the way I'm portraying Siddal's face, if you think about the sketches, the preliminary sketches that I put on the screen. So the first two, the one on the left and the center one, had her looking down, because I was so used to what the Pre-Raphaelites did as they portrayed women. And I was thinking, okay, if I'm doing a painting of Siddal, I kind of need to like work, like I want the painting to speak to Pre-Raphaelite art, but at the same time, I want it to be mine, you know, because I have a particular style, I have a particular way of doing things. So the more I kind of thought about that, the more I was like, well, I'm representing Siddal in a positive, strong feminist way, the way I portray all of my other female subjects. So why wouldn't I have her looking out at us and projecting a certain amount of strength? So that's what I did. Are there more questions?
Holly and Nat, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I just want to remind audiences listening in that a new rotation of Siddal's work is going on view this week at the museum, and that Holly will join us at the museum on April 10th for an artist talk in her exhibition. Another great chance to explore the exhibit in person. We hope to see you all at the Delaware Art Museum in the coming weeks. And Holly and Nat, once again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.